was glad when they said, come let us go to the house of the Lord. I was glad when they say, come let us go to the church with no walls. You are my brother, you are my sister. From all over the world we are united in the house of God, in the church with no walls.
I'm Ryan Dearbone, your host, and welcome to this edition of the Church with No Walls podcast. And today I am extremely pleased to be joined by another podcast host. There's a bunch of us, but there's only a few of us that are really good. I don't know that I'm in the good category, but I could say that I am interviewing somebody who is in the good category. So I'm
Wow, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hey, you're the guy. So DJ Culp, who is the host of Men.Church.Stuff, if I got that correct, right?
Men.Church.Stuff.
Men.Church Stuff. Good. See,
Yep.
That's why I say I'm not in the good category.
No,
I blew the lead from the very beginning. But Men.Church Stuff. DJ Culp is our guest this week. So DJ, first of all, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you on here.
Yeah, man. Well, technically, thank you that I get to talk to you again. You know,
Right.
since the first go at this was, I was at home and I had just had splotchy internet, so I appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you again.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we had a great time last time, and I think, that's why I was like, we had such a good conversation and such a good time that I didn't want a bad audio connection to not have you on the show and to be able to kind of talk like we did last time. So, I'm glad that you were able and willing to do it again. So DJ has been doing his podcast for a little while. So DJ, first of all, just kind of talk about where this podcast came from, where the idea for Men.Church Stuff came from, and how it got to from thought to conception to now where you're at here with the podcast.
I love reflecting on this story. I think podcasting, for any of your listeners, if they don't have a show, but they've got something that they've got to get out of them, this is seriously the format to do it. All right. So, I'm not going to go into my life story at all, but I grew up in church as a pastor's kid. So church culture and, the format that church operates on, all the mechanisms that kind of make the machine work, as it were. First of all, I've always been extremely used to that. But only in the last, I suppose it started somewhere, really, I think pre-COVID, where I began to realize, okay, maybe it's my own spiritual maturity. Maybe it's, just things that I've read, things that I've heard. I began to realize there are so many questions and topics that I want to talk about that, relate to spirituality, that relate to the men, or the role of men, whether it be in church, in the family, in the society, whatever the case is. But there's not a mechanism, and it's not a bad thing, but there's just not a mechanism in a church format for someone to really raise their hand and say, okay, wait a minute. I know we need to move on. I want to unpack this. I want to stick, you said something that might have been, it could be an absolute truth, right? It could be an insinuation on just anything spiritual that if you've ever caught yourself in church going, oh my gosh, I've never thought about that. I want to talk about that. Not, there isn't a mechanism in church that allows everything to stop for you to chase it. And again, the reason I said I grew up in church is I was just used to, okay, well, we're not going to talk about that. And so off it goes. But no joke, Ryan, I got to the point where I was about to blow up. And when I say that, I really mean it's one of the rare moments in my life where I've had maybe not something, but lots and lots of things compounding on top of themselves inside to where I couldn't handle it anymore. And I thought, okay, I've got to do something. I want so badly to create a format, to create a vehicle to just talk about stuff. And I have the personality where if everybody is on a train and they're like, dude, this is the greatest thing, everybody's doing this, I have the personality that says, I am out. Bye. I'm not doing that. If everybody's on it, that tells me everything I need to know, and I'm not there. So podcasting was that for a long time for me. Everyone just raved on it. I'm like, yeah, it's dumb. I don't really want to do it. And then I got to thinking, all right, so let's try it. I don't even know what this whole podcasting world is. So it started with me just listening to a golf podcast, and I got to realize, wait a minute, this is just talk radio. Like, that's all this is, except there's, it's not network and it's not corporate. I mean, I guess there's some that are, but it's just talk radio. It's just people that are creating these opportunities to have conversations about whatever they want. And so I started getting into it for several years, just listening. And when kind of the two data points began to connect, and I began to realize, all right, so if I want to create a conversation where I can open up these questions that I know for a fact I am not the only one asking, but there's not really a mechanism in church that allows you to ask it when it's on your mind. I could create a podcast that does that. I mean, why wouldn't I want to do that? And so that was the nexus of like the origin for the thought, right? I know for a fact I've got all of these questions that I want to ask, and because church is church, you'll never run out of questions to ask. And I got to thinking, all right, so who do I want to do this with? Because at first, Ryan, really, I just kind of thinking, well, if I don't want to do a men or a podcast on church, would I want to do a podcast on music? So I'm a music professor, and I quickly shot that down because I was like, that's my job. I do that every day, right. And I love talking about it, but I've got enough. And so my brother-in-law, who's been a part of our family for 20 years, at the time he was 18, Brad and I, and my dad, we have always, anytime we're together, we have always had such deep, fruitful, meaningful conversations that are always lighthearted. We never dive into the theology or bust, and if you smile, we'll shoot you. It's not like that kind of a thing. And so it's always lighthearted. We're always willing to be sarcastic and be real and be human. But at the same time, what are some of these spiritual truths that we'll get into conversations about? And I'm like, yeah, they're conceptual and they're theoretical, but we're always striving to kind of bring them back down to the ground, to where, I mean, you're a college professor yourself, that there's so many conversations out there that start theoretical, but they don't do anything. They just stay theoretical. Right. And you kind of walk away thinking, so what do I do with this? And that's another aspect of the show. It's not just talking about things that we think that matter, but we always try to answer, but why do they matter? And what can other people do with them in the situations that they may find themselves with? So I posed the show to Brad, and after about 6 months, he was going through stuff. I was in the middle of music season, concert season. The music department's nuts, right? And so it took about 6 months for us to really kind of figure out, let's go ahead and do this. And dude, we cranked the show up.
That's awesome. And so in the creation of the show, obviously it focuses on men and men's issue, and you kind of alluded to it a little earlier. Mm-hmm. Men, we're not really given what's the word I'm looking for? We're not really given the leeway to spend time and really ponder and to really go deep into things, because we are, for the most part, we're the breadwinners. We're the strong. We got to take things as they are and move and go and act and think, and that stuff is not. We're not really given the leeway to do that. So why is it so important to have a space like this where you can talk about men and church and just men in general, being able to kind of unpack some of these things that we really don't get a lot of time to do as the stereotypical man? Yeah.
Well, the very first answer, I mean, like right off the top of the bat, to me, it's the most important. It gives us permission, the space for this show, it gives us permission to ask questions. It gives us permission not just to not have all the answers, but to be okay that there are tons of things about the Christian life and the role of a man in the family and the role of man in culture and the role of man in sacred communities and secular communities. There's so many times it almost seems like our day-to-day, none of those paths intersect. And so we've got all of these identities and hats that we have to wear. it gives us a space, and this is so important to me, it gives us a space to be able to ask questions and stop and think, okay, so I don't know, and dude, that's a hard question. Like, what do I do with that? And based upon, I'm not saying that guys are any more analytical than women. I think that's that's a bogus statement. But a lot of times when, what you were saying, being the breadwinners, we take so much responsibility, or at least I think we should take so much responsibility of the health of not just our family, but also our church and our community. Like we're really important cogs. It's just the way God built us. And if that's true, I think it's actually almost malpractice to not have the freedom to raise your hand and say, I don't know, like, that's tough, dude. And we need time. I need time to process that. So one of the most important spaces that I want our show to occupy is asking questions that actually might have different answers depending on their context. Like, give you an example, Ryan. The show that we actually recorded yesterday that'll drop in 2 weeks. The title of the show is going to be True or False, More People, More Influence. So if we approach church from a consumer model, which is just as Americans, it's in our wiring, right? The consumer model of just, I want stuff, and the more stuff that I have, the more happier I'll be, or the more I'll be able to do. I mean, you can track that in a bunch of different directions. All right, so I don't think that it's necessarily a foreign thought to insert that idea into the way that we do church, right? We always want more people. Well, why do we want more people? Probably because we want more impact or more influence. So is that a false positive? Is that not to say that it's ultimately a false negative, but is there a chance that could actually be an incorrect assumption? And so those kind of spaces, those kind of questions, the deep, heavy ones that aren't necessarily theological in nature, doctrinal in nature, I want to ask. And so I know it's a cliche, but where the rubber really does meet the road, that's what I want our podcast to be so much about. To further answer the question about like guys specifically. So Ryan, growing up in church, it's not just that I never really experienced a ton of men not asking questions. I never really got the sense that guys cared. And I don't mean to stab us in the back, but my assumption is drawn from the widely known fact that women step up, and I love that they do this. Women step up in leadership where guys don't in a church setting, right?
Right.
So my assumption is, all right, well, if women are doing all of these things and taking all these initiatives, is it because guys aren't? Is it because women got there first, or is it because guys don't care? And like our men in general, are we just going, well, you know what? Somebody's got that. If somebody's got that, I don't have to do anything.
Right.
And so I not only want men to understand it is so safe and so natural and human to ask questions, but it's also not just safe, but I think it's part of our job, A, as men, B, as humans, and C, as Christians, to want to know we need to care about stuff. And the other, kind of the third big aspect is I may ask questions that you, Ryan, have already thought about. I may ask questions that you probably have already answered, but I also may ask questions that you've never thought about. I may ask a question that you don't care about. Like, the idea is that I want our show to just simply be another set of voices, another area where yes, men, but also women too, can tune in and think, I've not thought about this, or I am so glad that other people are dealing with this. You know what I mean? And everywhere in between.
And you as you were talking, it made me think about something. I was thinking about my growing up in church. You had your deacon board, you had the mother's board, and so
Mm,
how they worked a little bit differently. The deacons were kind of the old men that sat on the pew. They would, they do the prayer, they do all that stuff. But then the mother's board, they were doing a completely different work.
right.
And depending on how you looked at it, the mother's board did more, or they did more like driven with connecting with people, whereas the deacons, they were kind of the staunch men of the church. You knew who
Right.
they were doing their own
Dude,
thing.
staunch is a great word for that. Yeah.
And it literally just they were kind of like they were the fathers of the church. Now that there wasn't a bad thing, it wasn't a good thing, depending on how you framed it. But then
Right.
you were talking about learning things and knowing things. That's one thing that struck me, because I feel like, and as I get older, I'm trying to ward myself of this. The older we get, whether we've been in church for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, I don't know that we always ask as many questions, because I feel like we get to a point where we think, not that we know everything, but we know enough because we've lived enough years. We've
Right.
gone through
Yeah.
enough
It's a
circumstances and
dangerous place to be in, dude.
exactly. We feel like, okay, well, I've survived this, I've survived that. I read my Bible, or I've studied this, so I think I'm good. I'm not going to ask these questions, because I'm a what we call in our church a seasoned saint. I'm a saint that's been around for the block a few times. I know
Yeah.
some stuff.
Right.
I don't need to ask questions. I would feel, if I'm 60 years old, I would feel uncomfortable asking somebody who's 30 or 40, who's younger than me, a question about the Bible
Dude,
or
that's
about
legit, man.
theology.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, that's what I see. Do you see the same thing?
Absolutely. And I failed to mention this. Brad is a senior pastor outside of St. Louis, but I'm a music professor. So something that really kind of brings a nice balance to the show is both sides of like the pulpit, if you will, right? Like we got a church staff member with a not church staff member. And one of the things that I bring to the table that Brad doesn't is my academic background. I'm state school. Brad's got a bachelor's. I don't think he's got a master's, which is not a big deal. But I've got a bachelor's in music ed. I've got a master's in music ed. And I've got a doctorate of music ed, all state schools. And through my doctorate, I began to realize the further into my subject matter that I got, the more I realized, I mean, big time, how much I didn't know. And hopefully, like that's another one of the things that we tried to kind of, it's like an undercurrent of our show, is that we're never ever going to know everything. And if like you were saying, if you ever talk to somebody that thinks that they've got it right, you need to be very cautious
Right.
about what their stance is. And so I love that you're exactly right. The further into our lives that we get, yes, the more wisdom that we have. But one of the things that I always try to bring to the table is, what's another way to think about this? I accredit that to not just to just creative thinking. I personally accredit that to like my musical background as a jazz musician. One of the great jazz drummers on the West Coast back in the 50s, 40s, late 40s, 50s, and early 60s. His name was Shelly Manne, and Shelly Manne is quoted that as jazz musicians, we don't do the same thing once. So, meaning that we're always trying to find new ways to do things. So, anytime that I approach a Christian topic, I always want to ask the questions everybody already knows. But I always want, like, and specifically with our show, I want the listener to know for a fact, at some point, DJ and or Brad is going to approach something from us from a standpoint that probably you're not going to think about from a church setting. And so to me, that would defeat, if you will, the kind of the old codger, right? That's saying, this is my seat. I know what I'm doing. I'm good with who I am. I'm good with where I'm at. If you want something fresh, you can go talk to some other people. Like I try to kind of defeat that sort of stagnant, content mindset by asking questions that step on my own toes. And I love doing that. It's very refreshing. Sometimes it's really hard to have to address a question that even makes me feel uncomfortable, but we got to do it.
Yeah. And so within those bounds, we I feel like because of that, we spill out of the church because we look at a lot of times where most of the I wouldn't say misunderstanding, but a lot of the stereotypes, a lot of the stuff that we do comes through the four walls of the church.
Yeah,
Because when
that's
we're
right.
in the church, there is a construct that you follow. There is a pomp and circumstance. There is a certain level. Obviously, you get preached to, you get sung to, you get
Right.
prayed to, you get all these things within this tiny box.
Yep.
When you walk out, that's when you see it's really the things you talk about in action or in inaction.
Right.
So, and then you see a lot of people, whether they're senior saints, whether they're people who are younger, but they find fault with the outside religion, the outside use of theology of religion in order to
Yeah.
do God's work or God's will. There seems to be a disconnect and a void. So secularism becomes a thing.
Yeah.
How do you feel that like a podcast or some of the things that we do as outside ministries either add to what's happening in the church or in some ways maybe takes away or um, redirects what's happening inside the four walls of a church?
Yeah. So, to answer your question, let me start with like the socio-cultural side of it. Podcasting, I've realized this as a podcast host, podcasting is hard not to do a podcast, but to just get people to listen to it.
Right.
And so let's set like marketing aside, right? Because that's just simply discoverability and getting the podcast into people's ears. If they land on the show, how does the show address what you just said? I always try to make sure that my questions not only put the secular side of life in the crosshairs. I always want to make sure that our listeners know if we are willing to put somebody else in our crosshairs, then you had better be willing to put the crosshairs on you. Right. And that right there is Jesus saying, you're walking around saying that saying that your brother has a speck in their eye when you've got a log in yours. Right. It's that kind of mentality. And so, dude, you're exactly right that within the four walls of a church, there is a decorum that you meet. And obviously, depending on the church, the decorum changes. And depending on the denomination, the decorum changes. So how on earth is it that a visitor, say, and the visitor could be a Christian, could be familiar with church, could be a skeptic, could be a cynic, could be a militant atheist. I mean, the whole gamut. If they walk in, is our church not necessarily the format of the church set up to meet their needs? Because I would argue no. Right? If the format of the church is what we're trying to do, then the church doesn't even need to meet in a building. The church needs to meet somewhere else. So if we set the format aside, now what's left? Okay, so the people that are there, are we in the right headspace to meet them where they're at? And I mean, to me, dude, I'm starting to almost outline Jesus's ministry, right? I mean, he was not the one who condemned. He was the one who sat down and listened, but he questioned. He wanted to know, have you thought about it this way, right? So the Pharisees, you say this. Are you actually saying that if a donkey were to fall in the ditch on the Sabbath, you wouldn't get the donkey out, right? Like it's that kind of a almost like a backwards mentality. And so the way our podcast, at least I want it to serve the listeners, is when they leave the church doors and they find themselves, as you mentioned, right there in the middle of secularism. Are they in the right headspace? Have they thought about, this is what people think about the church? Don't worry about your eyes on secularism. This actually might be how people view the church. Mm-hmm. And to me, again, just using, because it's so fresh, the podcast that we recorded yesterday, I think it'd be crazy easy to see skeptics look at the church as simply wanting more numbers. They want me there because they want to feel bigger. And maybe they want more people because they think more people will naturally attract more people. that is a consumer mindset, which to a secularist, that right there is that's a very simple equation to work. But if they think that, I think it's very easy for them to become cynical and think, well, that means they don't actually care about what they're thinking. They just want people in their building.
Right.
And so, yeah, like our podcast, I try to serve, we try to ask questions. We try to have conversations that will empower not just guys on necessarily things to do. I'm not necessarily a go do this. I want people to think more about, all right, so where are you at? And when you leave your church, where are you at? When you go to your work, where are you at? In your headspace, in your spirituality, where are you at? Right? And what do you do with that? But also, how does that come across to people in the community? So that's really, again, that's why I say it's where the rubber meets the road. It's almost like a go-between, an in-between church life and regular life.
Yeah. And within that, I feel like we find ourselves, you can look at anything going on in the world today, going on in the country at this very moment. You could find, you'll find your sects of people that will believe what they want to believe no matter what.
That's very true.
And there are people that will fight church and state, separation of it, put it together. Everybody has their own thoughts on it. I like, for me, I try to stay out of the fray with it when it comes to religion, because it's too deep of a hole to dive in. But there is a responsibility, that we have, obviously, as podcasters, to talk about these things in biblical and in ways that touch on it without, getting preachy or getting too far from the topic. How do you balance some of the things that we're going through in these days and times in the podcast to make it relevant to your audience, but without straying from the biblical teachings that are part of what the goal of the podcast is?
Yeah, dude, that's a solid question. And this is actually it's a line that I want to flirt with more than Brad does. And that's actually, that kind of makes it a little easier. Neither of us, first and foremost, I need to say this, neither of us are rip-roaring ready to just take on the world of politics and the world of denominational territories. That is not what our show is about. That's actually not my personality, nor is that his. Are we both Baptist? Yes. Does that matter to us? No. And the reason it doesn't matter, and I said this to Brad, and I loved it. It's something I've kind of added to my vocabulary, that when we get to heaven, like, there's not going to be the Baptist suburb and the Presbyterian suburb and the Catholic, like there aren't denominational lines. It's just like Jesus, yes or no, right? And that being the central theme, it all boils down to, what do we do with Jesus? That guides our conversations more than, do we want to talk about all of these things that could sway the conversation in or out. Politics, again, denominational, or maybe not denominational. How about doctrinal? We don't really chase those. We don't, and it's not because it makes us feel uncomfortable. So with our audience being just the normal everyday person, not looking at necessarily activists on a political level or theologians on a spiritual level or doctrinal level. First of all, if people want to get revved up about politics, they got plenty of outlets. If people want to go dive into the world of theology, they actually have plenty of outlets. There are a lot of podcasts that are like they are devoted to that idea. And politics, same thing. And so from that, yes, we are conservative, but we'd rather try to keep our podcast more of like a universal thought, not universalism, but universal thought, meaning no matter where you are on any one of those lines, you can still come to our podcast and not get gaslighted in one way or the other. There might be some topics that you disagree with, but based on the conversations that we're having, they're peripheral. Brad and I approach it from very much the standpoint of We don't know anything. We know outside of the fact that Jesus is who he said he was. And the way that we convey that message is not we are right and you are wrong. This is what our show believes, and we're going to operate on that belief. And I think it's true, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to shove it down your throat. Quite the opposite. We need to talk about all of the in-betweens, right? So if I'm a visual person, so if you're thinking, so where does our podcast fall in let's go right wing and left wing? We are dead center. I suppose you could argue that because we're conservative, we're more right wing leaning. Okay, I'll take that, sure. But that's not really a point that we try to land on. If you're thinking, so are you conservative or are you liberal spiritually? I suppose that we would land in the more conservative. But here's the thing. That's not the point of the show. The point of the show is that we're two guys that don't have it together, that are trying to figure out how should Christians think? What are some thoughts? What are some questions about church? What are some questions about work? What are some questions about secularism, humanism, Christianism, right? Like all of these things, how do they all relate to each other? And so regardless, so Ryan, you yourself, regardless of where you really do stand politically or spiritually, you can come to the show and still get something out of it and not feel like you were either attacked or we're there to affirm you. You know what I mean? Yeah. We definitely try to be very objective from our standpoints, and we always use humor not as a way to pick at someone who thinks opposite, but rather as like more self-deprecating, right? We use humor as a way to just simply disarm where things could potentially get gaslighty. I would actually be, so we've got 112 episodes. I would be willing to say that and I'm being serious, there are 2 episodes that I think would be the most controversial. Number 1 is, I don't remember their numbers, but number 1 is women in church leadership. Mm. And number 2 is a Star Wars episode. And I'm not lying. Like the Star Wars episode, it's Boba Fett, Jar Jar, Akbar, Wedge. That one I think can be controversial. Right? And the smile on your face tells me everything that I need to know about the legitimacy of that controversial, because you know for a fact when you talk to Star Wars nerds, dude, I mean, dukes are up, right?
They will fight on it.
But at the end of the day, everybody knows, ladies and gentlemen, this is pretend. This is not real life. This has never happened. And the reason I mentioned women in church leadership is we do not plant our flag.
No.
I wanted to have an honest conversation of, I know that this can be a very hot topic. Why?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, does women in church leadership actually dictate the truth or the falseness of Christ? Now, if you want to get super theological, that's why I say there are podcasts that do that. But we bring in scripture, we ground our show in scripture, unless we're talking about Star Wars, but we ground our show in scripture, and we use real life, the day-to-day, as our, here's what we can do with it. So
you kind of already alluded to kind of what I was going to ask, so I'll kind of change up a little bit.
Yeah.
What is, out of all the 112 episodes you've done, maybe one of the topics that you found the most engaging or most interesting of all the ones you've done? Like what topic stands out to you, say like, okay, we talked about this and this really, whether it illuminated something for you, whether it was just something that was really, hey, I did not see this conversation going that way. What might that topic or a couple topics be?
Dude, that's a great question. And I'm serious when I say I don't think that we've published a bad show. So Grace versus Justice was a good one. Real humility versus false humility. Ministry and membership. That was a good one. Again, women in church leadership. That's women in church leadership is still the most listened to. But one of the more recent ones that I want to make sure, Ryan, that when our listeners hear us, that they know that we're not out to make a buck. We're not out to feed anybody any particular type of thing so that they'll pay for a podcast. I mean, we're not even, in terms of monetizing, we're not there. But that doesn't matter. I want to make sure that our listeners know that we are two guys who are simply trying to be as authentic as possible. Why do I say all of that? I recently had a scare with a possible diagnosis of prostate cancer. And episode 106, I titled it, Maybe It's Bad, Maybe It's Maybelline. Because for all I knew, this was going to be absolutely life-changing for my wife and I. And it wasn't. But we still had to go through that whole process. And I decided, you know what? It's time. I need to share this with our listeners, not just to let them know this is what we're going through, but to also let them know that this side of the microphone is not reserved for the happy-go-lucky, yeah, we're talking about some heavy things, but everything's still fine and hunky-dory. This side of the microphone is for a human who wants to explain and share humanhood with someone else that either has gone through it, that may be going through it, and there's somebody that has. Like, I want it to be real. And so anytime that we have a show, oftentimes, dude, I have multiple of those moments. A really fun one is episode 79. I titled it "Oh, Church Members." Like, and here's the thing: and I don't mean to single out a particular audience. But I really do want to speak more to church goers than non-church goers, because I think we have more negative impact on non-church goers than non-church goers have on us. And so, oh, church members, if you've been to church, you know who I'm talking about. Like, don't you, Brian?
In their head immediately think of certain people that just off that. Yeah, you're like, oh, okay, you're the reason why I don't want to come on Sunday, or I try to stay away from you. Like, hi, I think everybody can just by that title. Everybody pops at least a couple faces in their head.
I know. And one of my absolute favorite Gregory House MD quotes. I don't know if you're a fan of the show House, but
I've seen him a couple times.
Okay. Oh, dude, he's so good. He's my secular hero. So he's covering a class for another doctor, and he asked a question. And if you've never seen House, like, listen to your listeners, he is uber sarcastic. Love him. So he asked a question, and a kid in the front row raises his hand. And this episode, oh, church members, this quote makes me think of this show. He looks at the kid and goes, "I'm not going to like you, am I?"
I like that. Oh my God. That's good. Yeah, and then, I can see faces from my childhood,
right? I know.
All the way up to I'm not gonna say present day, but I can see some faces that, like, yeah, that quote would apply.
You're in a business meeting, guy raises his hand. Oh, come on, man. Why?
Of all times, just don't. I know you got something to say. Just not this time. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure this is where you're going. It's worse when it's in the church, because
oh my gosh,
sometimes, because not that we have to go to church, but we want to go to church. We prefer to go to church. But when somebody makes it an experience that's unpleasurable, then it's like, makes it harder for you to want to go, for you to
Yes,
want to get fed, for you to want to have those
that's
things,
right.
because that person or those people are the ones that kind of hinder the experience for you. And it's like, how do you reconcile? I
Yeah.
I want to go to church. I should be in church. I need to be in church. But these people, it's almost like it's a derivative of church hurt. I don't want to be there because these people are going to make me feel a certain way. They're going to say something. They're going to act a certain way.
That's right, man.
Lord, just give me a reason. Don't get rid of them, but let's
Yeah.
find a way to where I don't have to deal with them while I'm in that space or that place.
And actually, if my memory serves me correctly, part like where our conversation began to go, because I have had these moments of internally thinking, look, all I have to do to get away from this type of a voice, I'm just gonna, like, all we have to do is go to another church.
Mm,
And at those moments in my life, I remember distinctly, in my heart, the Holy Spirit saying, DJ, that if you do, A, there's going to be somebody else at the other church waiting for you that's just like this. But B, you're not doing anything positive to help change this kind of a narrative. And so if my memory serves me correctly, in episode 79, Oh Church Members, we end up really kind of exploring the world of, but excuse me, yes, those people are there, but doesn't that make it all the more valuable for us to stick around?
mm,
Because because we know for a fact that those people aren't going anywhere.
right.
So, like, not to say should we incur war, but rather how do we serve the church from the inside with a level head, and how do we approach it from a Christian perspective, to where we're still striving to keep the church healthy, but we're also trying to make sure that our brother or sister in Christ isn't actually being shunned like we desperately want them to be, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like, our human side says, look, dude, if you're not willing to look at the speck in your eye, I'm just going to let you walk around with it, as opposed to, want to have some more conversations about this, right? Like, and you can do that one-on-one, sure, but our conversation stayed more in the realm of, but how do we help combat that, not in a war rampage
Yeah.
revolution type of narrative, but rather in a lovingly and supportive and meaningful, healthy way. So yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where our show, it's what I love about our show, is that we head in those directions so often.
And I like that you brought it back to how can we be the ones to make it better, as opposed to just let's just throw the blame on them and it's their
Yeah.
fault and we have to survive or deal with them. But it was more of an internal, hey, maybe there's something that I can do to make this a little bit better. Something I can do to engage this a little differently. I think that's great. And I think that's where we get lost a lot of times, because we put the blame on somebody else, and rather than look
Right.
at the log in ours, we put the speck on somebody else, and we leave it to them to be the ones to make the change. And like you said, I mean, they're not going to change because they don't see a problem with
That's
the
right.
way they act, or what they do. So let me ask you this:
Yeah.
when thinking about, obviously, the conversations you have, the discussions you have, and with Brad being somebody who is in clergy,
Yeah.
how often do you have conversations that sometimes are indicting of the clergy? Because sometimes, a lot of people, and that's why people fall away from the church, they feel like either the clergy feels that they are above the law, or that they just don't necessarily agree with some of the teachings of clergy. They say, well, that doesn't sound, or that doesn't feel like what
Yeah.
I'm seeing or what I'm believing. So how often does the conversation lead to maybe not indicting the clergy, but really kind of questioning, okay, is this biblical? Is this biblical? Is this biblical for now? How often does the conversation kind of go in that direction?
Dude. And I mean this wholeheartedly, all the time. And the reason I say all the time is, Brad and I, we both understand and have understood for such a long time. And I think it's because we both did grow up in church, and we've seen and we've lived through the yays and the boos. And and like the super highs and the crazy, like, is this really happening in a church setting? Those kind of lows. We understand fully that the question and the nature of Christianity in terms of the relationship of pastor to congregation and congregation to pastor, that relationship is in fact a two-way street. It is not, we don't take the stance that church is a top-down structure and there is never an opportunity or there should never be opportunities for it to be a bottom up. One of the things that Pastor Brad, listen to me. One of the things that Brad says all the time is, I'm human. I'm a guy. Yes, he's called to the pastorate, and pastors are called. We believe fully that really is a calling, but we do not excuse the congregation from the ministry calling that that Christ calls us to, right, through the resurrection and through the crucifixion, resurrection of the Son, right? I mean, the whole idea that like Christ lives in us means that I'm a direct ambassador, and he's a direct ambassador. He just so happens to be called to the pastorate. So we bring those two levels closer together, which is why clergy comes into the conversation so often. Because outside of the position and role of leadership, not dictatorship, but the role of leadership in a church setting, outside of that, it's just humans serving with other humans, and everybody's broken. And like we reject the notion that the pastor should be closer to God than anybody else. Because that's ridiculous, right? I mean, like, I don't accept the idea that God has structured humanity in a way to where some people are closer to Him than others, right? I think the Old Testament, I think you got grounds for argument then, but with Christ's coming and who He claimed He was, who He said He was, and who He ended up showing that in fact He was all of those things, then like, as again to your questions, kind of like the way I'm seeing it is like the centrality of your question is how do we address kind of like a place of leadership versus a place of service-ship, if you will.
Right.
We both approach the pastorate not just as a leader but as a servant.
So with this, we kind of touched on this the last time we talked. Being the man, the husband, the father, the whatever, leading our families, being the person who in a lot of ways is considered to be the spiritual leader of the family. It's supposed to be the husband that is, helping to teach and train their wives and their children about religion. It gets hard because, like we said, we run into the fact that we don't ask questions, the fact that we're not always seeking that deeper level. What do you feel is our responsibility when it comes to taking care of the spiritual health of our families, of those closest to us? What is our responsibility, and how do we, we're never going to be perfect at it, but how do we get to that better place where we're doing it at least in a way that hopefully is pleasing to God and hopefully helpful to them?
And parenting is another central theme of the show, for sure. So our approach, when we take a look at Ephesians 5, where Paul dives into the wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord, and husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. That right there is our starting place to the answer to your question. That if I'm not serving my family, if I'm leading it, again, in kind of like a dictatorial role or an authoritative role, I'm not doing any good to them. Right? God did not show his love for us by maintaining His great giant authority and us, if you don't do what I say, I'm gonna kill you. If you don't do what I say, I'm just gonna thump you. And like he showed us, showed his great love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so we approach parenting and leadership in the home in the exact same aspect of how is it that I'm serving my family? How am I loving them? Absolutely. But also, like, I think, you mentioned we should be leading and training kind of our wives in spirituality. I think there's some truth to that. But at the same time, I also think that we need to be open to what they say because, right, like scripturally, when two people are joined together as one flesh. So therefore, yes, God or Christ lives in me as Christ lives in my wife, but because both of us spiritually are one flesh, Christ also lives in both of us. And so he may speak to my wife in a way he doesn't speak to me. He uses her as a way to lead me in thought and vice versa. I'm not convinced of the man will always lead the woman in all things. I don't see that as an equal partnership, right? I don't see that as one flesh. I think logically I see that like as in terms of let's go proportion, like an 80-20, right? So if I've got 80% of the spirituality, she's got 20%, now I'm with you. But if it is in fact we are one, then there are moments where I need to be serving my family by listening to them. I need to be serving my family by prayerfully and spiritually leading them and saying, okay, we need to do it this way. And I agree with your implication that my wife, that Sharon, my wife, needs to say that way, only because she thinks or she has enough faith and that I'm acting in a godly manner, right? My kids, what's the intern? So, but yeah, we do approach parenthood and our conversations from that aspect as well.
And so, as we wrap up, for people that are interested in checking out the podcast, Men.Church Stuff, when can they get it? Where can they get it? How can they get it?
Yeah. So, let's start with where. We are on every major podcasting platform: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Pod Addict. I think that's what it's called. There's another one, I can't remember the name of it. There's a bunch of them that I don't use, but I know that we've got them out there. But the two major ones are podcasts and Spotify. We also have a YouTube channel. Now our YouTube channel isn't like a video feed like I'm seeing you right now, only because it took so much time on my end of things. But we have a YouTube channel that has all the audio for our podcasts. They come out, our shows come out every Tuesday. And so we're a weekly show. Every now and then we'll skip a week, but for the most part, 95 to plus % of the time, we'll have a show every week. And they can find us also at we've got a website, Men.Church.Stuff.com. Men.Church.Stuff.com is where they'll find us. And we also have a Facebook group and an Instagram account.
Nice. And so they just type in Men.Church Stuff on Facebook and Instagram as well.
Yep. Yeah. And I think actually for me, if you're okay doing this live, because Google already knows like everything that I search for, would you type Men.Church Stuff into Google and tell me what you get?
Let me do it right now.
Yeah.
And while I'm doing that, let me ask you this question. So for the fact that you have these different social media avenues, how much of some of the topics come from the feedback from your audience? How much do you use that in crafting, okay, this episode, because we've gotten feedback from an audience member saying they want this conversation or they want to hear about this. How much does that drive some of the episodes you come up with?
Well, to be quite honest, we don't have a ton, and I would love more, but anytime somebody has something that they want us to talk about, we absolutely cover it for sure.
I'm looking up to us.
There it is. And so you just typed in Men Stuff, right?
Yep.
And there it is.
Stuff, and I see it.
There we are. Yeah, man. So it like your listeners can go to Men.Church.Stuff.com and they can just type Men Church and the word stuff into Google, and it'll pull as well.
That's perfect. So DJ, this is the second time I think the second time might have been better than the first one. I think we had some great
I agree, dude.
conversation.
I was actually thinking that. Yeah, combo went great.
And we'll have to do this again. I'm gonna have to jump on your show. You're gonna have to come back on mine, and we're gonna have to do
I'd
this
love
again.
to.
But
Yeah.
I think this is a great conversation. Don't forget, if you're listening to this podcast, check out Men.Church Stuff. Check out their socials. Check out their YouTube. Check it all out because it's going to be a good time. You'll get to learn something. You'll be able to engage. And you can hear DJ is highly intelligent, highly passionate. It's going to be a great listen. So with that, DJ, thank you for your time on the podcast.
Thank you, man. It's been an honor being on here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Good deal. And you have been listening to the Church with No Walls podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dearbone. As always, take care and be blessed.
I was glad when they said, come let us go to the house of the Lord. I was glad when they say, come let us go to the church with no walls. You are my brother, you are my sister. From all over the world we are united in the house of God, in the church with no walls.